Welcome to What in the World, a project initiated by Hungry for Life International. Today's podcast is titled Ukraine Update with Chad, and Abby will be interviewing Chad Martz. So grab your headphones, sit back, relax, and listen as we hear about what is happening in Ukraine and how our relief efforts are going.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of What in the World podcast, where we talk about everything to do with running an international nonprofit. Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Chad Martz. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me.
Yeah, no problem.
So for anyone listening that might not know you or might not know what your involvement has been in Ukraine, and specifically what your past year has looked like, maybe just share a little bit about that.
Sure. We moved to, my family and I moved to Ukraine, I would say, I think it's 5 months before the war started. My wife, Mary, has been a project manager for Ukraine for probably 19 years. And so when before the war broke out, we were discussing how we could best respond to the situation. And then when it did, it was all hands on deck for months and months and months, and still going on today. We were right there when the war first broke out and are continuing to respond to the needs as we see them in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have a very unique perspective coming into talking about the situation, talking about Ukraine. So for some people that might not have been tracking as closely with the conflict and how it's progressed, what are some of the current changes? What's kind of the current state of the conflict?
You're not going to hear as much of it in the news, but I would say since September, Ukraine has taken two pretty significant areas of land back that they had originally lost. We had the opportunity to go a few different times into those deoccupied areas, but as of right now, most of the news are going to say it's like in a stalemate position, but I always hate using that because it sounds like nothing's going on. Mm-hmm. It's very, very intense fighting along the front lines. There's just not a whole lot of movement in terms of taking large pieces of land on each side. I would say at this current time, Russia's doing a little bit more of the incremental advancements in terms of what they're taking, but by no means is this like a frozen conflict. There's a large amount of military on both sides that are each day dying. And so what is also increased since September, I mean, Russia has sent rockets across the country throughout the war. Sometimes military targets, sometimes civilian targets, so it's always an unsettled feeling within the country. But it just seems like there's more and more that are being hit in terms of the targets where civilians are, and the strategy of Russia to beat Ukraine into submission by taking out all of their energy infrastructure. And so that's they're not winning on the battlefield, so they're trying to pound Ukrainian submission over the winter months by taking out as much as they can in terms of their the energy infrastructure within the country.
And talking about those civilian targets, myself and some other staff members at Hungry for Life were able to come to Ukraine earlier this year in October. And while we were there, there was a bit of a shift in what some of those civilian attacks were looking like. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Like they're utilizing and they gain different weapons. So drones that they've received from Iran. So they were using these low flying, very loud drones to hit different infrastructure. And so they also use that along with missiles that are being sent from the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and then from air through jets. And it changed because there was attacks not just in specific areas of the country, but all across the country.
That random attacks that you kind of can't really predict.
Right. So, I mean, one rocket lands right in the middle of a home, right in like the western part of the country, or as far as Lviv. I mean, they were attacking at the beginning of the war there, but there had been some time where it hadn't received anything. So people are kind of trying to get used to regular life. And as you know, you just pass through there when rockets were being rained down again into the city. So that continues to happen. And the more recent one too was the one where they hit the residential apartment building. It's in the east side of the country. We actually drove through, I think, 3 days prior, and there's been over 45 civilian casualties from that attack. So this is the very unnerving aspect of people living within the country, where you're trying to live a life in the war, but yet you have all of these attacks that can happen at any time, and that's it. Like it's so unnerving and unsettling for people.
Yeah, and as you were saying, some of these things we don't really hear as much in the news this side of the world. And a lot of that is just because of how a news cycle works, but a lot of that is because this information, like there's just not a lot of people on the ground that have access to places like this, and the stories aren't really being told. So yeah, it's really good to have you here. And you were actually just in Ukraine. You just got back last week. Yeah. So welcome back.
Thank you.
So share with us a little bit about what that time looked like for you.
Sure. Well, again, because of the choice that my wife and I have made for us to continue to contribute to the response in Ukraine, she's spearheading it. So she's stays in Ukraine. So the first part of it, we just flew in after Christmas time to kind of just have a little bit of family time, a few days there. And then the next part of the trip is actually we wanted to travel to where our longest standing partner, which just happens to be Mary's sister and brother-in-law, and to also bring some other family members along with, just to encourage them, to surprise them, to encourage them. They're the ones that have stayed in the east under constant, like if you saw the town that they're in and the amount of attacks, it's 20 to 100 rockets a day. So they're under some immense pressure all the time, but they've chosen to stay. So for us to go there, to surprise them, to be with them over like Ukraine Christmas, which is also celebrated on the 7th of January. It was really important for us to do that. And as a family, just to take your minds off the war and just talk about family things, even do like it's kind of surreal actually what I'm even talking about, because you're playing like a game and yet you're having air sirens outside and rockets that are being launched in towards your direction, but you're playing these games. So that was the first part, was to continue to strengthen and encourage them. And then we wanted to travel into two areas that we had not ourselves been, to kind of assess it. And so we went close to where the most intense fighting is. Okay. There's a pastor there that we had worked with in the past that has stayed, and he arranged for us to bring much needed food supplies into a community that's quite close. Like, it's really unnerving. You go there because this is where the most intense fighting is happening. Yeah. It's military everywhere. It's tanks, artillery, like it's constant rockets going out and coming in. So it's a pretty intense area, and the unnerving part is like there's such a small defense line between there and the village that we were there to provide. Okay. And just to think, like, if Russia were to break through, that they would actually be coming through that village. It's I mean, people have been under this for so long, it seems kind of like normal for them, but most places that we've gone to that are near the front, you don't have a whole lot of young females like your age that are still there, but there was still quite a few in this village that we saw, and it's like I said, it's a little unnerving. So that was the first part, was to see what the current needs are there and how we can best help. And our partner there, one of the biggest needs that he said was actually supplying fuel for heat for people's homes, and the best way to do that was to bring like coal, so people can use that in their homes. And so the day that we left, we were arranging for a big dump truck to come, and then for people in the community to come and load up coals to be able to provide heat into their homes. So that was the first part. The next one was to go into the most recently deoccupied area, which is in the Kherson. That's more in the south. Right. Okay. That was the area that you were talking about earlier, one of the two places that Ukraine had gained back. Yeah. So that was the most recent one that they had gained back. They pushed Russians across the Dnieper River and took back control of that area. So weird for me, because I'd been to where that front is in Mykolaiv so many times, and seeing the road with all the roadblocks and you can't go past it, and now we are actually able to drive past it. It was really eerie. But to go into those areas, and the same thing, to see what the current need is there, because again, you have a lot of like the perceived need, or what's big on the news right now to get to those certain areas, and that's fine because people need help there, but we also want to make sure that we're getting it to people who are really in need. And so that's why we're there, just to kind of assess it and bring food and different things like candles, toilet paper, because people have been without the regular necessities of life for such a long time.
So you were mentioning some of the Hungry for Life partners that you've been working alongside and visiting during your most recent trip. When I was there, I got to meet a few of them and just see kind of the level of exhaustion that they were experiencing back in October, and how there hasn't really been any sort of let up since then. And you have kind of been tracking with them throughout. And so just share a little bit about how they're doing, and also how their work and life has kind of continued to evolve as the conflict has evolved and changed and the needs have changed.
I would say this is just as important for us, which is why we're going to all these areas, is to try to continue to encourage and motivate the partners that are choosing to stay and live in these areas. But the amount of emotional stress of it, it's, I don't know how you measure it. It's deep, but there's no, there's options. I guess they could leave, but the how can they leave the people? Like there's just not a whole lot of workers left in some of these areas, and for them to leave, like that's a pretty big moral and ethical decision they would have to do to pick up when they're the ones that are supporting so many people. And so how are they doing? I mean, most of them, they're living, like learning to live within the war, but that doesn't make anything easier. Underneath, like it's just like the rest of the country. People are on the, like, I would just say above the surface, they're putting on a brave face, what they're going through, because it's more difficult for the next person, and that person, it's more difficult for the next person, all the way to the end where it's more difficult for our soldiers who are defending us on the front lines. But just below that surface, it's just an immeasurable amount of trauma and pain that they're going through. And some of the ones is like the most recent pastor that's chosen to stay, that's right near the fiercest fighting. So his wife took refuge in Europe because it's just too much. I mean, it's day after day, constantly. You don't know when this is your last day, and it's traumatizing. But that's also extremely difficult for to be in these high stress situations, but to be without your spouse. And so it's happening with military, but it's happening also with some of the partners that we have, that the spouses are not there, that this is a big difficulty. And we've heard of some of our partners who have had spouses now in Europe that, you know what, now they're actually tasting what it is to be in a European country and not seeing a whole lot of options to have a successful life post-war even, and not wanting to come back. So, but yet you've got some of the men that are, because they can't leave the country, who are fighting for the country so much. And so this is this rift, and I don't blame those who are going into Europe for wanting to necessarily stay there, but it's caused some additional hardships for people who are choosing to stay and work in the areas that they're working. Yeah,
so many ways that people are physically divided, and so many ways that people are just strained. Yeah. And there's so many kinds of stress that are just piled on top of one another. So talking through that, describe a little bit of what it's just kind of like in the daily life of living in Ukraine for these people right now.
Well, for right now, the additional thing that's happening is the lack of electricity. So this has caused again, this is not... Russia's not been successful in bringing Ukraine to its knees because of the lack of electricity. But I just for listeners, just think for 1 second that you don't have electricity for let's say for 8 hours in a day. So you got 2 hours and then it's off, and then you got 3 hours and then it's off. Actually, in the West is probably the worst in terms of the amount of electricity that we have available to us. Ukraine has done a remarkable job at continuing to repair it. So most of the places that we were going to in the East had it. Some of the places where we were doing the distributions, they had not. So like in Kherson, that was just liberated. Russia, when they were fleeing, they blew up the what do you call it?
Power station?
Yeah, the power station, so that they didn't have it. And then they were able to repair it after Russia had left, but then Russia was using artillery and bombed it again. So they've been without power for quite some time. That's why the basic necessities like candles and toilet paper and hand wash and
the coal you were talking about.
Coal and even like food, like these are the like basic things that are really important for people. But in the everyday life, how do you do it? So I'm going in and I'm getting my hair cut. Okay, so the power gets cut off. Well, what do you do? Not everybody has the ability to have a generator, and your margins in your business, if you're running off of fuel instead of electricity, is not as high. So you're just done. We've got other friends of ours who had businesses but they need electricity to be able to do it, so they've just shut down their business. So it's another added layer to the already incredible hardships of people. You're not going to have people complaining because they know it's that much more difficult for the next person. But this is a very, very difficult one. The one thing that's been a positive is that how temperate the weather has been in Ukraine.
Okay.
They had the initial like cold, but it's the temperatures have stayed pretty good in comparison to previous years. When we were in the east side of the country, it did get down to minus 15, but that was only like a few days of that. But for the most part, it's been pretty good, which has been really helpful because you're not using as much energy to consume to heat homes that have it. And so because there's not as many people in the east anymore, there's like 7.5 million displaced Ukrainians within the country itself. A lot of them are in central and western Ukraine. So that's a lot more where the energy consumption is, which is why we have also less of it. Yeah. But it's hanging on by a thread. So yes, it causes a lot of difficulties for people who just to maintain jobs. So that's why when people ask like what's in terms of like food, it's not. It wasn't like it was in the first 3 months of the war where people had no access to like food, but now it's like, okay, we're starting to have a little bit more access to food, but now it's like, do you have the resources to actually purchase it? And it's becoming this really thin line for people. And that's why we feel food is still such a major component to help continue to sustain the country, even if people are not necessarily, let's say, like starving per se, but they're just hanging on by a thread, and we've got to continue to help them to be able to sustain the country as best we can.
Yeah, totally. And that's a good comparison. Like there's not a lot of things that people here can understand about the experience of Ukrainians right now, but thinking about not having power, that's something that, we don't really have to the same extent, and we do have more backups here. But just think about all the things that you can't do if you're at work or you're at home and the power goes out and you're in the middle of cooking something, or your freezer starts to de-thaw, or you can't run your business. And all the things that affects, because then you're not able to store food long term. And so then how it looks like to even purchase food, like how can you even store it, and all those kind of things, the chain effect of not having, and then also the challenge of gas stations when they don't have electricity, and not all of them have generators, and there's just so many implications of not having power. And so that's it's a big part of daily life right now for them.
The daily life, because let's break it down to even school. So you have your kids that go to school.
Yeah.
But for one, when the sirens go off, you have to go down into the bomb shelter, and that can last. Like we've had sirens stay on for 3-4 hours at a time. And then if the electricity is also kicked off, like kids have their little LED lights, headlamps, and they're doing their work in the dark. Like it's like you just have to think, your daily life, how this affects everyone. Like you're no longer able to take your kids to like a sporting event inside, because how do you power, let's say the hockey rink, and if there's an air siren, you can't keep playing. Like this affects everything. So even for our own home, we average about 8 hours of power during a day. But once power comes on, like we're fortunate enough to have like laundry and a dryer, which not a lot of people do, but we have so many people coming through our home. How do you go through and wash all the sheets and laundry that you need to? You have to you got to start running everything right away, because you have to get all of this closed down before it shuts down, right? And so to be able to continue to keep your home available for people to come in and stay in, and being able to wash everything that you need to wash, you have to really plan out your days. So they are making it a little bit easier in terms of with an app to inform you when the power should be off and on.
Okay.
And so you can make sure that you plan that you're at home for that time, so you can get those things done. But this is no longer like you having a schedule of things. You're planning around when power is available to be able to get the things that you need to get done in a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just disrupts so much of life. Yeah. So you have been able to kind of track with and sit with and pray with and laugh with and cry with so many of these Ukrainian people throughout the conflict. So share a little bit with us about where people's minds and spirits are at this point.
It's still an incredible resolve, but I don't say that word lightly. They're in it because there's no other option presented in front of them other than being taken over. And they know, and they've seen, and the world has seen what the Russian world brings. So you have this exhausted resolve, I would probably put it. But when you start, because you have relationships with people, and so when you're asking like, how are you doing? Yes, they say that they're good, they're fine. I mean, God's blessing us in this way. But when you're taking the time to spend with him and getting deeper into that, the amount of level that they've had to deal with. So even on one of the last trips that Mary was on before I arrived, she was at one of the deoccupied areas where the pastor of the church was taken and tortured during the time of captivity. They broke his arm and his leg, and yet he chose to stay in those areas. You have other partners that continue to go through horrific and horrendous things. So even the ones that we stay with typically, we were with them on this last trip, and she was showing us that a rocket had just hit just across the street from them. So you have this unnerving, you have this resolve, but it's like the level of trauma that people have. I know for myself what it is, and I'm still not the one that's on the front line every single day. So I'd say don't be confused by people's they're resilient and they are being upbeat because they still are living in a free country. Most of it, there's still occupied areas in Ukraine. But I mean, you just start scratching a little bit below the surface, and it's extreme. So even we were in Kherson, and we only had about time for about 15 minutes to sit down with this new couple that that was remaining in this deoccupied area, and she was sharing a story of how she had to take her daughter and hide her in the attic when Russian troops came by, because Russians were coming in and taking young girls and using them for sex slaves. And then when Russia was getting pushed out and Ukrainian military was coming in, they just took and rounded up those girls and they just executed them. And so it's for her, they've been under 9 months, they not knowing what's happening on the outside, because communication is taken out. You don't know what's happening. You don't know if the rest of Ukraine is taken over. You don't know what's happening. So to live underneath this, and for them, they thought too that Russia was there to stay. There's all the billboards. There's Russia's now moving in, and they're bringing in their own passports, their own currency, trying to do their own school system. I mean, they even shared a disgusting story about what Russians were doing with school children. But you're living under this for 9 months, and so when you go there and you're talking with them, some of these things are starting to come out now. So like she was just in tears. We had not met her. She was in tears within 2 seconds, trying and just recounting this story. And then her husband comes in and was telling us that when Russia came in March and took over, that's during still the school year, but nobody's sending their kids to school anymore that are still remaining that didn't have a chance to flee. So Russian was offering money for people to bring their kids to school. And because there are, there's pro-Russian people within the areas of the country, they saw this as an opportunity to bring their kids. And to be able to make money, and they were bringing their kids to school. And he's sharing us how the school has the army with their guns, balaclavas, and they're handing their kids off into the school. And then the Russians then told the parents that the kids were going to be going on a trip, and they ended up taking the kids to another part of the Russian occupied territory, and the parents have still not seen their kids to this day. They actually just took their kids. So you have all these different layers.
Yeah.
You have how difficult it is for people in the West because it's life was hard enough already, but now there's a huge amount of people in that area. But then you have people who were under the occupation of Russia and what they're processing and trying to put their lives back together after everything was just taken because Russia would just pillage it. And then you have those who continue to live on the front lines and are under the constant threat all the time. So there's like these different levels of trauma and hardship, but it doesn't like people from the West or East. I don't want to say one's greater than the other, but there's just some different levels.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And you're right. There's so many different levels of trauma and levels of just like hardship and dealing with that day in and day out, like the dealing with it while it's actually happening, but then dealing with it after. Like how do you just continue on like living your life? And something that was a big part of what we were doing when I was there, and something that you and your family and the partners do when you guys are there, is just sitting with people and singing with them. So talk a little bit about the role of like song and just like fellowship and how that plays into the ministry. Yeah,
for people that don't know, like some of the areas we go in, you can't spend a whole lot of time because it's dangerous. So you can't have big groups for a long period of time. However, just as important it is to bring food for people, song is like an emotionally healing, deeply impacting act that you can do for people. And so each place that we go to, because not myself, but my other side of the family, they're very good singers. And so for them to be able to do that for people, it's extremely healing for them just to sit there and be able to do that. And then to speak into people's lives too. Not that we know what they were going through, and not that a food hamper solves all their problems, but for us to come all the way from where we are to let them know that they have not been forgotten, that people here have contributed in the West and in other countries to continue to help them, and we just happen to be the ones on the end there that they see, but they don't see all the people who are behind us that have contributed to make this happen, to bring help to them. And I always want to make sure I communicate that to people when I'm there, to encourage them to keep going, because that's the best that we can do. So yeah, song is incredible. Just listening to their stories. People have been very open to sharing their horrific experience, but it's like they need to be able to share it with somebody. And so that's also the opportunity that we take. But some areas, like these newer ones that are hot areas, we don't necessarily get a chance to sit down with a lot of people, just because of you can't have large gatherings. It's just not safe, and you kind of have to get in and get out sometimes. But I wanted to actually talk about, because you were there too, and we put on an event for widows from the war, and there's like 60 widows there.
Yeah.
And so you walk into it and you feel this incredible weight walking into this church that's hosting this event that we put on to encourage them. But to think through, like, this was 60 widows, and the amount of military that we're losing per day, it's right now it's between 100 to 200. And just to be thinking, like, because I can visualize it, because you can visualize it, you were there, But to think that that's happening all across the country, how many widows, and the pain that was in that building. And again, on the outset, like when we were distributing and we're giving food to ladies, and they're so grateful, and they're showing a smile. And even the one younger girl that attended with her mom, and I think you'll remember it quite easily because she had a tattooed outline of her dad on both. It said Papa on the front side. On the other side, it had the outline of her as a young child holding her dad's hand. And on the outset, it looks like, you know what, okay, they're doing okay because that's what they show. But I had actually did a post, I think, on social media, and she saw it, and she reached out to me, and I asked them how they're actually doing, and she said it's been extremely difficult. They end up having to leave from their home because their mom just can't handle being day in and day out with the memory of their dad that's no longer there in that house. So they went to Poland, but in Poland she does not have a job. There's no like community support around them. She's in constant depression. She's crying all the time. Their son is bitter and angry, and she's still there with it. So, you know, when we were there and we provided them these gifts, and they're happy and grateful for it, and that's kind of like the picture that we see. But when we start getting down to it, how difficult it is for people still. It's heart-wrenching to know that.
Yeah, and the long-term impacts.
Yeah, and that's for all the people. So I have to be wary too, because we present, like when we show distributions and we're providing food, and people are very happy to be able to receive it. But behind that smiling face, there is just so much behind it that's going to be needing to be restored for decades. Yeah.
And I was, the other day I was watching this interview that David Letterman did of President Zelensky, and Letterman was in Kiev actually just like a week after we were there, after we were in that region. And Zelensky was mentioning just the idea of like the whole country is fighting this war, the whole country is behind their soldiers, and stories that he was hearing and things that he was seeing of when Russians would come into villages or cities, just the people that would just grab whatever they had and fought for their homes and their families, even if they weren't military, they're just civilians, and they just believed so much in what their country was fighting for that they would just grab whatever they could and fight back. So what of that are you like hearing or experiencing or seeing?
In turn, like as of right now, or at the beginning of the war?
Well, just throughout, like people's willingness to just like fight for what they believe in.
Well, in at the very beginning, it was all hands on deck with it. So Russia moving into certain areas, you would have people putting human barricades in front of them, or babushkas who hold a lot more respect, openly challenging Russian soldiers that are coming in, like, why are you here? To the other parts where you had across the entire country, all of the block posts were from volunteers. So it was people with regular jobs were volunteering and the block posts are everywhere. This is every entrance and exit out of all of the little communities and cities had block posts. So that's a large amount. And so it's not just people who are there, but they need to be supplied with like creating the block posts with materials that come from the city. So our partners were involved with that. For
people that don't know what block posts are, maybe just describe that a little.
Yeah, so block posts make it so that you're checking each vehicle that's coming in and out of a community. So you're checking your documents, where they're from, and doing a little bit more research. So at the beginning of the war, they put up these block posts everywhere, where they actually created called like the tank busters, where they took steel and made like the X's. So it made it's more difficult for tanks to go through, to putting sandbags along so that they had positions that they could shoot from with a little bit of defense. But that's what a block post would be. And then there's curfews throughout the country in different regions at different times, so you can't enter into certain areas, and you can't get out of certain areas. But these were manned by volunteers, but it wasn't just them manning it. It was communities that were building these block posts, providing the wood, providing tools to build it, providing food for the soldiers constantly to bring it out to them. So to your question, it was all hands on deck everywhere. Where it is now, it's still the same in the sense that it's a complete unified effort. It's a society that is based on how to contribute to the war. I mean, you can live your life, but most people are still working at contributing to the war, whether it's with their own resources to help military, help supplying needs for military or for people that are coming through. Like it's still all hands on deck. I mean, there's people that can stick their heads in the sand and not be affected by the war somewhat, but it touches everyone. Mm-hmm. So everyone is still unified in their response to be able to defend the country against this aggression of Russia. Yeah,
and even just in the time that I was there, I heard so many people say, like, we believe so wholeheartedly in fighting for our country, and we will be Ukraine or we will be dead. Like, we will fight for this land and for our families and for our country and our culture and everything that means to them, and just experiencing that, like, that pride for your country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they've seen the things that Russia has brought too, which I think everybody knew a little bit on the surface, but couldn't really fully comprehend what that would be. And so the way that they've conducted war and how they've come in and what they have done, and again attacking civilian infrastructure and apartment buildings and taking children and doing despicable things within communities, it's pushed the heels in even further for the Russian people or Ukrainian people that this is just not. I mean, we're going to fight to every last person, because this is not what we're going to live under anymore. We're our own country, our own people, and we're not going to be living under it. So what Russia has done to try to break the will of the people, it's pushed them to a greater resolve. But I don't know, humanly speaking, I don't know how long human beings can last under that kind of pressure. But when the alternative is what Russia brings, that's why everybody's still the same, and like we'll fight to the last.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like an option.
To them, there's not an option.
Yeah,
there's no option for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're sitting down and you're talking with people, what are some of the things that you're hearing them say about the war? And
I would say it's, I mean, maybe not a good thing, but there's quite a deep hatred, as you can imagine, with like I mentioned, 7.5 registered displaced people within the country. You've got 7 million registered that have fled the country. You've got how many tens of thousands civilians, how many tens of thousands soldiers. You're beginning to develop a real long-lasting hatred for what is taking place. And so we've seen a lot of people that were kind of like a little bit more on the fence that are nowhere near that fence anymore from what they've seen. And there's going to be a segment that would want to see the repayment of Russia, but most people just want them just gone. It's not like they necessarily want to march to Moscow and take over their government. So they just want them gone to be their own people in their own country. That's like how they don't want much. It's just what they have, and Russia's decided to come in and take it in despicable and disgusting matters. So there's a deep sense, and I don't know how that's going to be repaired with a neighbor. But it's not a time to talk about it's not a time to deal with it right now, because they're still they're still under attack each and every day.
So we're coming up to actually the 1 year of when the war started last February. And so as we approach the 1 year of this war, what would be something that you think that people on the other side of the world should remember, keep in mind about this situation?
Yeah, I mean, being back here in Canada for a little bit, like I'm in, like this is my life, was dealing with the response to the war. So coming back here and maybe people not, because it's not in the news anymore, not really understanding what's still taking place. And I'm not like upset about it. People only know what they know in terms of the war. And I would say the biggest thing to know is that just because it's not in the news, these horrors that that they witnessed beforehand they're still happening today. And so, and there's just no way that Ukraine can do this on their own. They have the will, they have the resolve, they have the willing to adapt to many different things, but they can't do it without the help from the West. That's militarily and humanitarily. And so I would say that's for people here, how can they best help, or what to know is to continue to pray for the workers in Ukraine, continue to pray for the people in Ukraine, continue to pray for those who are separated over months and months and months of being separated. So that would be the biggest thing. I would say, if I were talking more on like a positive from like a spiritual standpoint, and what we've seen in a lot of the churches in the front line, they don't have a whole lot of members that are still remaining there for good reason. But even this last church that was, again, right closest to the most extreme conflict, there's 20 members remaining, but yet the church has 200 people attending it. And that was not just there. It was where I was mentioning where that pastor was tortured. He also has a large amount of people that are coming that are non-church people. And even when we were in this last distribution, there was some material about the Gospels that we had with us. And again, we never force anything, anything. If anything, we're kind of holding back a little bit, but we're giving the food hampers, and people were taking the food, putting it in their vehicles, and actually coming back and asking us for this material. And this has happened on numerous occasions, and numerous churches that continue to have people that are seeking something, and they're looking for the church for it. And so as much as this is a devastating time, it's also a time of an incredible opportunity to bear witness to people when your life's at stake and there's not a whole lot separating you between life and death. Yeah, people are searching for something, and they're searching for a truth. And it's amazing how receptive people have been to that truth that we hold in Jesus. And so I would say, if there's a positive side of it, it's how God is using the workers and those who remain in the churches to continue to not only provide on a physical level, but a spiritual level for people. Really, the church is so much holding up that country in so many different ways. So really pray for the workers so they can continue to be that support for people. That's one of the biggest ones, I would say, outside of peace that would be eventually coming to the country.
Yeah, totally. Even when we were there, just the how crucial the church felt in that community, and all the widows that came, and how they had just started this group of widows that could come and fellowship together and sing together and eat together. And immediately they were like, we need to do this on a regular basis because there's a huge need here. And they were so willing to just put that together on a regular basis, to be able to have groups of people come together and host and welcome people in. And yeah, there's so many ways the church is extending the hands and feet of God out into the communities, where people just need something, right? They're looking for something. They're looking for answers. That was going to be the next question as well. Like, people here, if they, want to do something, want to contribute. Yeah, you said prayer. Just like some ways that people can.
Yeah, prayer. Again, it's probably the same thing that we say each time. It's prayer and support, so we can continue supporting the relief efforts. However, it looks like it has. I mean, we adapt to it as what the needs are as well too. And so we're trying to combat the lack of electricity and how to provide for people with that. And that's like getting like little headlamps for people, or battery powered lights in their homes, or candles that are an economical way of doing it, providing food, but then also providing a source of heat, to even to the point where our partners are helping to rebuild a family that their whole house and tool shed was completely destroyed. They're up there this week with a church group to help repair it, so he can start generating an income again with repairing vehicles, machines, that sort of thing. We're limited with what we are limited by the abilities of what our partners can do. So yeah, we'd love to be able to repair all these homes all over the place, but there's not a huge amount of workers that still remain, but we are continually adapting to it, and being able to have the financial resources to continue to adapt to that is not just now, but in the future too. So again, I know it's always cliche, but the prayer and the resources are it's much needed for responding to this crisis.
Yeah, and I mean, might sound like a cliche, but really prayer, like, is, like it should be kind of the first thing that our minds go to, of like calling on the creator of the world to come alongside and to comfort people and to bring restoration. So yeah, it's definitely something that we all need to be reminded about, the power of prayer, especially in situations that seem like they're just so much out of our capability, right? And we can give it to God. And
yeah, because I mean, look at, I'm not going to attribute it all, but I mean, we've been praying so much for the protection of people. And really, if you look on paper, like, you should really, Russia should have been in complete control of the country. They should have been able to walk in and take it, but they didn't. Like, what do you attribute that to? Like, yeah, there's military and people were fighting and all coming together. But what do you attribute where you have the second largest army in the world coming in against a very inexperienced military outside of what they've experienced since 2014 in the East? But really, looking on paper, this should have been a walkthrough, and they didn't. But why? So is prayer powerful? I'm just using this as an example. Yeah, of course it's powerful, but we need to continue to have it. I've seen it in my own personal life being there, and with the huge weight and responsibility that you have to serve people there, I don't know how I would have made it without the prayer of people and God giving us the strength to do it. There's just no way that it's possible. So I'm not saying that lightly, and yeah, it might sound cliche, but for those workers that are still there, they need desperately those prayers to be able to keep going. Which is also why we continue to use our home and offer it to those who need a little bit of a break to come in to just detach from the front line of the war a little bit too. But prayer is such a massive thing for the country, and it's on my heart, and obviously every single day. It's all consuming for me, but I know it's cliche, but that's the reality of what people can continue to do. Yeah,
and a part of that is you coming here and talking with me and sharing this with other people, so that people can be reminded, and people can know how to pray, and people can know how to praise God for stories of how you have been able to help others, and how Hungry for Life has been able to meet needs of people and minister to people who are in these situations. And so thank you so much for coming on and sharing all these things, because people really do want to know. And a lot of these things, this information is just hard to find. There's not a lot of people that have this kind of experience and perspective. And so we're very, very thankful that you're able to come on and share with us today.
Cool. And I think the one key thing for people to know, too, in terms of what HFL is going to do there, HFL was there before the war for 19 years. We were there before the war broke out, and we're going to be there long after the war.
Yeah.
We see it. I see that in talking with my wife, like that we are there. So people are wanting to contribute, not just for now, but for also later. We are in this for the long haul, for the restoration of this the country once we gain victory. So I just want to make sure people do know that. Just because they might not be hearing the news doesn't mean that we haven't stopped doing what we're doing over there, even if they don't necessarily see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, and thank you guys for listening. And we'll see you next time on What in the World.
Thanks for listening to What in the World, where we seek to educate and inspire. Here at Hungry for Life, we are passionate about your group having a global impact in eradicating needless suffering. For more information, head over to our website at hungryforlife.org, and you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and wherever you may listen to podcasts. Tune in every other week for another conversation about what is happening at Hungry for Life.